Elliot Crane leaned back in his creaking office chair, the glow of his monitor casting long shadows across the cramped walls of his apartment. The dim hum of the city outside filtered through the single-paned window, mingling with the soft clicks of his keyboard. It was another dead-end night spent chasing threads that didn't hold. Yet that was the nature of his work, a freelance journalist scraping at the edges of conspiracy theories and mysteries too wild for the mainstream. Just as he reached for the half-empty coffee mug beside him, a soft ping alerted him to a new email. His inbox was a mess of automated press releases, angry responses to old articles, and spam promising easy money. But this email was different. The subject line read, "For your eyes only, NASA's Black Lake." He hesitated, then clicked. The email contained no introduction, no sign-off, just a single sentence that sat in the middle of the message like a challenge. "There's a black lake on the moon, and NASA is hiding it." Below it was an attachment labeled Lake Footage Confidential .mp4. Elliot paused. Years of chasing urban legends had taught him to be skeptical of everything. Most tips were either hoaxes or bored pranksters looking for attention. Still, something about this felt different. He downloaded the file, watching the loading bar creep forward as his chest tightened with anticipation. The video opened to shaky, grainy footage clearly captured from a helmet camera. A low-pitched hum filled his headphones as a barren expanse of the lunar surface came into view. It was unmistakably the moon. The gray, powdery landscape, and the Earth hanging above in a crescent glow. Then the camera panned to reveal something that shouldn't have been there. A vast, black expanse stretching across the horizon, its surface impossibly smooth and reflective. It rippled faintly, like liquid disturbed by an unseen breeze. The person behind the camera whispered something, a fragment of speech Elliot couldn't quite make out. Suddenly, the camera jolted as the astronaut stumbled. The feed became erratic, distorted by bursts of static. Elliot could make out faint, garbled screams. A shadow, a large, undulating mass, passed briefly across the lens before the footage abruptly cut to black. The final frame held for a moment longer than necessary, a set of coordinates stamped at the bottom, followed by the initials EH. Elliot sat back, his pulse hammering in his ears. He replayed the video twice, trying to pick apart the details. Was it a hoax? A doctored clip? The moon had been studied for decades, mapped by satellites, explored by astronauts. There was no record of anything like this, no lakes, no mysterious black substance. But the coordinates were real. He cross-referenced them with lunar charts and confirmed they pointed to a region near the moon's south pole, far from any known landing sites. A quick search on EH turned up nothing definitive. The initials could belong to anyone, or no one at all. Elliot leaned forward, fingers poised over the keyboard. He needed more. A name, a connection, anything. Hours passed in a blur as he scoured forums, old NASA documents, and archived interviews. He found whispers of a classified mission, Artemis Blacklight, mentioned briefly in a declassified budget report, then scrubbed from all official records. According to what little information remained, the mission was abruptly cancelled after an unidentified anomaly was detected. Elliot's phone buzzed, breaking his concentration. It was his editor, no doubt, checking on the status of the article he'd promised. He ignored it, his focus unshaken. Digging deeper, he found scattered accounts of an astronaut named Dr. Evelyn Hart, one of the lead engineers on the Artemis project. She'd vanished from public life years ago, shortly after the mission was scrubbed. No public appearances, no interviews, just gone. Elliot leaned back, his mind racing. Was she the EH from the video? Could she still be alive? As dawn approached, he finally broke away from the screen, his eyes bloodshot. The coordinates from the video burned in his mind, and the image of the Black Lake, its impossible smoothness, the faint ripples, haunted him. He decided to reach out to Dr. Evelyn Hart. A quick search revealed she wasn't listed in any public directories, but he found a lead, a decade-old property record for a house in upstate New York under her name. Elliot grabbed his phone and dialed the number attached to the listing. The line rang twice before clicking to voicemail. He left a brief message, identifying himself as a journalist interested in her work with NASA. He didn't expect a response. Hours later, just as he was about to collapse from exhaustion, his phone rang. The number was unlisted. Elliot Crane, a woman's voice asked, low and trembling. "This is Dr. Evelyn Hart. You're making a mistake chasing this." Her words sent a chill down his spine. "I'm just trying to understand what I saw," he said, trying to keep his voice steady. "Is it real?" There was silence on the other end. Finally, she said, "Meet me in person. I'll explain everything, but only once, and come alone." Before he could respond, she hung up. Elliot stared at the phone, his heart racing. He had spent years chasing whispers and rumors, but this felt different. This wasn't just another conspiracy. This was something far bigger. And it wasn't just a story anymore. It was personal. Elliot drove through the empty streets of upstate New York under the cover of night. His headlights cut through the fog, illuminating the skeletal branches of leafless trees lining the narrow road. Dr. Evelyn Hart's address led him to a remote house perched on the edge of a dense forest. The building itself was unremarkable, a squat two-story structure with peeling paint and a sagging roof. Yet, as he approached, an uneasy feeling settled in his chest, like a phantom hand gripping his lungs. He parked a block away, taking a moment to steel himself before walking to the front door. Every step on the cracked concrete felt louder than it should in the still night air. Before he could knock, the door opened slightly, revealing Evelyn Hart's thin, pale face. Her hollow eyes darted behind him before she motioned him inside. The house was dark and cluttered, the faint smell of mildew permeating the air. Evelyn shut the door and bolted it with trembling hands, layering it with 3 locks and a chain. She didn't say a word until they were seated at a small kitchen table, the single lamp casting harsh shadows across her face. "Did anyone follow you?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Elliot shook his head. "I don't think so. Dr. Hart, Stop calling me that," she interrupted sharply. "I haven't been Dr. Hart for a long time." She took a deep breath and folded her hands, her knuckles white. "You shouldn't have come." "You called me," Elliot countered. "You said you'd explain everything." He pulled out his recorder and placed it on the table. She flinched at the sight of it, but made no move to stop him. "You have no idea what you're digging into. If you're smart, you'll walk away." "I'm not walking away," Elliot said firmly. "I saw the footage, the Black Lake. It's real, isn't it?" Evelyn's shoulders sagged, and she looked older in the dim light, as though she had been carrying a weight far too heavy for far too long. "It's real," she admitted, "but it's not a lake. Not in any way you'd understand." "What is it?" Elliot pressed. Evelyn hesitated, her fingers twitching nervously. Finally, she began to speak, her words slow and deliberate. The Artemis Blacklight mission wasn't just about exploration. It was about extraction. We found something beneath the surface of the moon, a substance we called voidium. It was unlike anything we'd ever seen. A liquid mineral, jet black, with properties that defied physics. It could store energy in ways we couldn't begin to comprehend. If we could harness it, it would have revolutionized life on Earth. No more oil, no more coal, just limitless, clean power. Elliot's recorder captured every word as his mind raced. What went wrong? She laughed bitterly, a hollow sound. What didn't? When we drilled into the deposit, the voidium started to spread. It consumed everything it touched, rock, equipment, even air itself. It wasn't just a substance. It was alive. Alive, Elliot echoed, leaning forward. She nodded. It reacts to stimuli. It grows. It changes. But we didn't realize how much until it was too late. The first signs were small, a rippling in its surface like it was breathing. Then the contamination began. Elliot felt a chill creep up his spine. Contamination? Evelyn's eyes darted to the window, as if expecting something to burst through the darkness. It wasn't a virus or a chemical reaction. The voidium infests. It seeps into living tissue and rewrites it, molecule by molecule. The astronauts on the mission, they were the first to change. It started small, a tremor in the hand, a rash, but then their bodies began to twist. She swallowed hard, her gaze far away. One of them, Commander Blake, started screaming during a routine check-in. By the time we reached him, his arm was wrong. It had split open, sprouting something that looked like bone, but it wasn't. It was smooth and black, like the voidium itself, and it kept growing. By the end of the day, he wasn't human anymore. None of them were. Elliot's stomach churned, and NASA just covered it up. Evelyn laughed again, this time with real anger. Of course they did. They abandoned the mission and left the outpost on lockdown, sealing everything inside. The official story was a systems failure. No one questioned it. No one ever does. But the footage, Elliot said, someone leaked it. Who? She shook her head. I don't know. It wasn't me, but someone wants the truth out. They're playing a dangerous game. Elliot leaned back, trying to process everything. And the lake? It's still there. Yes, Evelyn said, and it's still growing. We thought it would stay confined to the moon, but... She trailed off, her face pale. But what? Elliot pressed. There's evidence that fragments of the voidium made it back to Earth, she said, her voice trembling. Even a microscopic amount could be catastrophic. It adapts. It learns. If it reaches critical mass here... She didn't need to finish. Before Elliot could respond, there was a sudden noise outside, a faint metallic scrape against the side of the house. Evelyn froze, her breath hitching. They're here, she whispered. Who? Elliot asked, his voice hushed. Instead of answering, she grabbed a heavy flashlight and motioned for him to follow her to the back door. You need to leave, she said, her voice urgent. Take what you've learned and get as far away from this as you can. If they know you've spoken to me... The scrape came again, louder this time, followed by the distinct crunch of footsteps on gravel. Evelyn shoved a piece of paper into Elliot's hand. Coordinates, she hissed. The outpost. If you're insane enough to keep digging, that's where you'll find it. But I'm warning you, this isn't just a story. It's a death sentence. Elliot wanted to argue, to demand answers, but the fear in her eyes stopped him. He nodded and slipped out the back door, his heart pounding. As he disappeared into the forest, he glanced back at the house, just in time to see a black, unmarked van roll to a stop in front of it. The last thing he heard before the night swallowed him was Evelyn's voice, rising in a scream. The shuttle's cabin was dark, lit only by the faint glow of instruments and the soft blue shimmer of Earthlight through the small viewport. Elliot sat strapped in, his fingers tracing the edge of the scribbled coordinates Evelyn had given him. He couldn't shake the memory of her words, the terror in her voice as she spoke of the lake. Now he was here, hurtling toward the moon, carrying nothing but questions and dread. A mechanical voice crackled over the intercom, snapping him from his thoughts. Approaching lunar orbit. Final descent in 5 minutes. Elliot leaned forward, peering out the viewport. The moon's surface stretched below him, a wasteland of craters and shadows. He spotted the glint of metallic debris scattered across the gray expanse, the remnants of forgotten missions left to rust in the silence. As the shuttle dipped lower, the landscape shifted, revealing jagged ridges and deep canyons shrouded in darkness. The outpost was hidden near the southern pole, buried within a crater whose walls cast shadows long and deep enough to hide entire cities. The shuttle's autopilot guided it toward a flat, dusty plain near the coordinates. With a final shudder, the landing thrusters fired, and the craft settled onto the surface in a cloud of pale regolith. Elliot unbuckled his harness, his hands trembling as he pulled his helmet into place. The interior lights dimmed, replaced by the cold, clinical glow of his suit's HUD. He double-checked the seals, ensuring there were no leaks. Oxygen levels stable, pressure normal. The airlock hissed as he stepped inside, the walls vibrating slightly as the exterior hatch released. With a burst of stale, metallic-smelling air, the hatch slid open, revealing the moon's desolation. The silence was overwhelming. Elliot's boots crunched against the surface as he stepped out, each movement amplified in his ears. The only sound was his own breathing, a rhythmic reminder of his fragility in this hostile place. Ahead of him, the outpost loomed like a ghost. Its structure was low and angular, half buried in dust. Time and the elements had weathered its surface, leaving it scarred and discolored. One of the exterior panels had buckled inward, exposing a tangle of wires and piping. A faded NASA emblem was still visible on the hull, a pale echo of humanity's hubris. Elliot approached cautiously, his eyes scanning for signs of movement. He half expected the ground to shift beneath him, or a shadow to dart across the edge of his vision. But there was nothing, just the crushing silence and the ever-present glare of Earth above. The main airlock door was ajar, hanging at an awkward angle. Elliot slipped inside, the sudden shift in light and texture making him flinch. The interior was eerily intact, as though the outpost's inhabitants had simply walked out one day and never returned. Dust coated the floors and walls, disturbed only by faint trails that crisscrossed the corridor, footprints frozen in time. His helmet light swept over the walls, revealing faded signs. Medical bay, observation deck, engineering. He followed the arrows pointing toward the observation chamber where Evelyn's coordinates promised answers. The air grew heavier as he walked, his every step echoing in the confined space. He passed rooms filled with abandoned equipment, tools strewn across workbenches, monitors dark and lifeless. A storage locker hung open, its contents spilled onto the floor. Some of the items were melted, warped into unrecognizable shapes. Elliot paused at a large set of double doors, their surface streaked with scratches. The observation chamber. He hesitated, his hand hovering over the manual release lever. A strange vibration seemed to hum through the metal, faint but persistent, like a heartbeat. With a deep breath, he pulled the lever. The doors groaned as they slid apart, revealing a massive domed room with a single reinforced glass wall stretching from floor to ceiling. Beyond it lay the lake. Elliot froze, his breath catching in his throat. The footage hadn't prepared him for this. The lake wasn't just black. It was an absence, a void that seemed to consume the light around it. Its surface was unnaturally smooth, rippling faintly as though something massive stirred beneath. The air in the chamber felt wrong. Even through his suit, Elliot could feel it pressing against him, a weight that made his chest tighten. He stepped closer to the glass, unable to tear his eyes away. The lake reflected the observation chamber back at him, a twisted mirror that distorted reality. Then it moved. A ripple spread across the surface, slow and deliberate, as if the lake had become aware of him. Elliot stumbled back, his pulse racing. Shapes began to form beneath the surface, vague, sinuous forms that writhed and shifted like smoke trapped in liquid. The chamber trembled. A deep, resonant thrum filled the air, vibrating through his bones. The glass in front of him shuddered, and hairline cracks began to spiderweb across its surface. Elliot turned to run, but the chamber's lights flickered, plunging him into darkness. His suit's lamp cut a narrow beam through the black, illuminating the doorway ahead. He sprinted toward it, the sound of cracking glass following him like a predator. Behind him, the lake erupted. A wave of black liquid surged forward, smashing through the glass with a deafening roar. It moved impossibly fast, defying gravity as it twisted and climbed the walls. Elliot glanced over his shoulder and saw it, the mass of the lake coalescing into a shifting, amorphous form. Tendrils of liquid lashed out, smashing into the walls and floor, each impact sending vibrations through the entire structure. Elliot barely made it into the corridor before the chamber collapsed. The sound was deafening, a cacophony of twisting metal and rushing liquid. He didn't look back. The outpost shuddered violently as he ran, the walls buckling under the pressure of the lake's expansion. He reached the airlock and slammed the emergency release, throwing himself inside just as a tendril of black liquid reached for him. The hatch slammed shut, and for a moment there was silence. Elliot staggered into the shuttle, gasping for breath. He keyed the ignition and the engines roared to life. As the craft lifted off, he looked back through the viewport. The outpost was gone. In its place, the lake writhed and grew, spreading across the lunar surface like a living shadow. Its tendrils reached upward, clawing at the departing shuttle, as though unwilling to let him go. As the moon shrank behind him, Elliot collapsed into his seat. But even as he drifted further from the cursed surface, he couldn't shake the voice that echoed in his mind. A low, insidious whisper that followed him into the void. "You will not escape me." Elliot's body was weak, his muscles trembling as the shuttle breached Earth's atmosphere. The engines roared, their vibrations rattling the cabin as gravity reclaimed him. He felt the weight pressing down, a suffocating reminder that he was returning to the planet he had fought to protect. But there was no relief in the descent, no sense of victory. He sat slumped in the pilot's seat, his suit still streaked with black stains that refused to fade, even after he had scrubbed them with disinfectant. He could feel it, the itch beneath his skin, the unnatural warmth crawling through his veins. The lake hadn't just let him leave. It had sent him back as its messenger. Through the viewport, the Earth came into focus, a blue beacon of life framed by the vast black void. For a fleeting moment, Elliot felt a pang of sorrow. Everything he had ever known was down there. Every human, every city, every fragile corner of the world, oblivious to the horror he carried with him. The shuttle jolted as it entered the lower atmosphere. Warning lights flickered on the console, but Elliot barely noticed. His focus was on the faint, rhythmic pulsing in his arm, just below the surface of his skin. He peeled back the sleeve of his jumpsuit, biting back a gasp. Black veins webbed their way across his forearm, pulsating faintly in sync with his heartbeat. The infection was spreading. It wasn't just inside him, it was becoming him. The lake's voice had been silent since the moon, but its presence lingered, a dark, invasive whisper at the edge of his mind. He had tried to fight it, tried to convince himself that he could still contain what had already begun to take hold. But as the shuttle's autopilot guided him toward the landing site, he realized the truth. The lake hadn't sent him back to destroy. It had sent him back to grow. The shuttle touched down with a violent shudder, its landing gear creaking as it settled into place. Outside, floodlights illuminated the tarmac, and the silhouettes of ground crew moved toward the craft. Elliot sat motionless, his breath shallow as the hiss of the exterior hatch opening echoed through the cabin. A wave of humid earth air washed over him, carrying with it the faint scent of rain-soaked concrete. The ground crew's voices crackled over the comms. "Elliot Crane, welcome back. Are you able to disembark?" He wanted to answer, to tell them to stay away, but his voice caught in his throat. He reached for the console, his fingers trembling, and pressed the intercom button. "Don't. Come closer," he managed, his voice hoarse. "Sir, are you injured? We're here to help." Help? There was no help for this. Elliot clenched his fists, trying to suppress the growing heat radiating from his chest. The black veins on his arm had spread to his hand now, dark tendrils creeping beneath his fingernails. He could feel the lake inside him, pushing, straining against his control. The crew didn't listen. The sound of boots on metal echoed as they climbed the shuttle's exterior ladder. Elliot's vision blurred, the edges of his world warping as though he were staring through rippling water. His reflection in the console screen twisted, his pupils dilated, his skin pale and slick with sweat. And then, in the corners of his eyes, he saw it, movement beneath the surface of his flesh. Something shifted under his skin, a fluid ripple that traveled from his shoulder to his chest. His stomach clenched, and a strangled cry escaped his lips as pain racked his body. He doubled over, clutching his sides, his breath coming in shallow gasps. The first crew member entered the cabin, his flashlight cutting through the dim interior. "Mr. Crane, are you—" Elliot looked up, his face contorted in agony. "Don't touch me." But it was too late. The black veins on his arm surged, and his hand moved on its own, reaching out toward the man. The ground crew's flashlight clattered to the floor as Elliot's fingers brushed his suit. The man screamed, a sound that was immediately cut off as black liquid erupted from Elliot's palm, snaking up the man's arm like living tendrils. Elliot recoiled, horrified, but he couldn't stop it. The liquid spread, consuming the man's body in seconds. His skin bubbled, his limbs twisting into grotesque shapes as the black ichor devoured him from the inside out. When the transformation was complete, he stood motionless, his body an amalgamation of flesh and voidium. The other crew members shouted in panic, their voices echoing outside the shuttle. But it didn't matter. The thing that had once been a man turned to face them, its form rippling with new growths. It moved with unnatural speed, leaping out of the shuttle and into the group below. Elliot crawled toward the hatch, his strength fading. He peered out and saw chaos, the infected crew members spreading the lake's touch to the others, their screams filling the air. The black tendrils grew rapidly, weaving into the ground, consuming the tarmac, and spreading toward the nearby buildings. Elliot collapsed, his vision narrowing. He felt the lake's presence surge within him, its voice returning, stronger now, reverberating through his very being. You carried me here. My roots will grow. My waters will rise. Tears streaked down Elliot's face as he clawed at his chest, desperate to purge the alien invader. But it was useless. His body was no longer his own. He could feel the voidium coursing through him, binding him to the lake, making him its herald. The last thing he saw before his vision faded was the city skyline in the distance, its lights twinkling against the dark horizon. He knew the lake would reach it. It would reach everything. There was no stopping it now. As his mind slipped into darkness, the voice whispered one final time, a chilling promise that echoed into eternity. The lake stirs, and soon all will drown.